So in this video, I continue the discussion of the genealogical approach to democracy, and of course, always keeping in mind the connection with the cooperative economy. And we saw some of these issues cropping up in the last lecture with regards to Greek efforts at colonization, military efforts, and other contexts. So here I continue with the case of Rome, which I interpret as a setback for democracy. It says here, to begin with, we have a notion of political centralization that is defined by the will to dominate, the focus on military power, and the character of the national idea, as many historians have agreed. So while in the case of the Greek polis, a centralistic union against the Persian never came about, Rocker cites Hegel, who argues that the Roman principle was entirely geared towards domination and military power. It had no spiritual center in itself for the purpose and occupation or enjoyment of the spirit. And while in the choice between autonomy and heteronomy, the Greeks continually chose the former, the Roman Empire was by no means an association of citizens, but ein Herd untertan, or a herd of subjects, actually suggests Kropotkin. Finlay suggests that one of the defining features of Rome is the devolution from status to order. As I spoke of in the last lecture, one of the defining features of Greek democracy is the status of citizenship or non-citizenship with respect to owning property or participating in the political everyday. And Finlay comments that this status was increasingly unimportant in the evolution or devolution from Roman Republic to empire. Says Finlay, the key lies not with the slaves, but with the free poor, and I believe the elements can be pinpointed. He says, the starting point is the trend visible from the beginning of the monarchic government in Rome, from Augustus on, in other words, to return to a more archaic structure in which orders again became functionally significant, in which a broader spectrum of statuses gradually replaced the classical bunching into freemen and slaves. There was in effect a reversal of the process that had transformed the archaic world into the classical. Thus, as Finlay continues later, in Italy and elsewhere in the West, where for some centuries we found genuine slave societies, the effect was the more drastic one of a shift away from slavery to the colonnade. The colonnade, of course, was a feature that was seen in the medieval ages and during the decline, the collapse of the Roman Empire. The decline of slavery, in other words, was a reversal of the process by which slavery took hold. Once upon a time, the employers of labor in these regions imported slaves to meet their requirements. Now their own lower classes were available as they had not been before, from compulsion, not from choice. So there was no need for a sustained effort to keep up the slave supply, nor to introduce wage labor. Thus, the legal extension of corporal punishment and torture to the lower classes among the citizen population was not just an exception, it was a qualitative transformation in social values and behavior, argues Finlay. In addition to this decline from status to order, there also was quite a shift in the nature of slavery in Rome, which is defined by an ambiguous relationship and with slaves both obviously seen as conscious and autonomous beings, but also as property. Again, Finlay here says that interestingly, that the solution is at least that which Roman jurists devised was simply the return of the slave to the master for punishment when there were situations of crime or capital crime by the slave. Servus sub poena vinculorum domino redere, which he accomplished by imprisoning the slave in ergastulum while continuing to exploit his labor. So this means basically it was a private law matter. Since your property damaged or murdered someone else, you deal with it. The solution reveals the paradox at the root of the classical conception of slavery. which combines what we later see in Hegel, which Hegel refers to as self-reflecting consciousness, with property relations. Regarding tolerance of this ambiguity, Finlay comments that societies, even civilized ones, have repeatedly demonstrated their capacity to survive for long periods with such tensions and contradictions. In fact, one can distinguish the difference in attitudes towards slavery in the Greek and Roman periods by means of literary representations of the institutions. Thus, Kuffel remarks, because of their association of it with tragic fate, slavery was no laughing matter to the Greeks of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. Greek comedy had its Thracian guards, but no true stock of slave characters as Roman comedy did. Thus, in principle, slave could hold a tragic role in Greek theater, as we see, for instance, in Euripides' The Trojan Women, whereas this was unthinkable in Roman theater. A last issue, of course, is the legal legacy of Rome, where we do see the nature of the state of being impacted by bureaucratization and professionalization of the legal profession and the state apparatus. Thus, Finlay comments that even after the conversion of Constantine to Christianity and the rapid incorporation of the church into the imperial power structure, there was not a trace of legislation designed to turn away from slavery, nor even by gradual steps. On the contrary, it was that most Christian of emperors, suggests Finlay, Justinian, whose codification of the Roman law in the 6th century not only included the most complete collection of laws about slavery ever assembled, but also provided Christian Europe with a ready-made legal foundation for the slavery they introduced into the New World 1,000 years later. Roman law, of course, had difficulties with intermediary entities such as corporations. One only has to look at the Pellicula for an example of this. And also the legacy of slavery was enshrined for application in the Western Hemisphere, as I just suggested. Moving on to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, what one did see after the collapse of the Roman Empire, again, was a quite confused state of legal and social practices and traditions entangled in quite a muddle of the remaining carcass of the Roman administration. And amongst this carcass and this muddle, you did see slowly the rise of free cities. The revitalization of city life in feudal Europe, argues Oliver Dowland, between the 11th and 13th centuries is of considerable political importance. Its driving force was a scale of mercantile and organized artisan activity not witnessed since the collapse of the Roman Empire. This meant that new legal and government institutions had to be forged to facilitate this activity. This was, above all, a period of great political consolidation, and the leading agency in that consolidation was a new emerging mercantile class. Amongst these could be seen the popolo as well, which often consisted of the lower classes amongst the mercantile and artisan classes. The popolo is the Italian cognate for demos, which discussed a popular political society based on inclusive rule, often forming a parallel government to central communal authorities. As Koenig comments, the final goal of the popolo was perforce to take control of the commune and to reconstitute it. As part of this offensive, the people sought to have its laws recognized as communal laws. It can be described as the voice of the commoners, in contrast to that of the older nobility. Generally, the popolo movements supported equal application of the law, wide participation in electoral practices, and a strong working relationship between government and guilds. Thus, in cities where the popolo had taken power, the supreme governing body was usually of 12 or so members, with office rotation between 2 and 6 months. Also, very quickly, to speak of the role of citizenship in these free cities at the time, Oliver Dowland suggests that the conception or the concept of citizenship in the commune was not as precisely developed as in the ancient Greek polis. Eligibility to the pool from which electors were drawn was probably limited to those who paid taxes, belonged to a recognized guild, or owned property. It is unlikely that the poorest members of the community would have taken part, since they would have been considered vulnerable to corruption. Servants were also regarded as unreliable because they were not independent of their masters. There is, however, some evidence that members of the artisan class served on high executive bodies such as consulates, priorates, and anciani. Citizen participation in government and administration increased dramatically during this period, especially on part-time paid basis, also similar to the situation in Athens after Cleisthenes. I think it was Pericles actually who introduced pay to the day-to-day jurors in the courts in Athens. Thus, we do see some similarities with the process of democratization in classical Athens, but also certain distinctions. For instance, in Florence, there was no clear sense of a citizen's entitlement, unlike the Athenian category of citizenship, which was a vertical division, including both rich and poor. Nearly all political participation in Florence was organized in terms of the horizontal guild category. So to which guild or which profession you belonged was more important than whether you were a citizen of the commune or the city, the civitas or not. This left many excluded. Thus, the return from status to order that accompanied the imperial Roman stage was at best only partially reversed in the Italian civitas of the Middle Ages. There was also a very fascinating re-encounter with Greeks after or during the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, which occurred over many hundreds of years and saw many refugees that were actually then, as Jakob Burckhardt observed, central in reintroducing Italian and European scholars to classical Greek scholarship. It is amazing to recall the pedigree of some of the scholars who contributed to the Italian Renaissance. According to Burckhardt, that colony had begun with Manuel Chrysolaus and his relative Johannes, as well as with George of Trebizond. Then came around the time of the conquest of Constantinople, and afterwards John Agricopoulos, Theodore Gaza, Demetrius Chalcidolos, who raised his sons Theophilus and Basilos to be competent Greeks, Andronicus Callistos, Malos Musuros, and the family of Lascaris, among others. However, since the subjection of Greece to the Turks was complete, there was no new learned offspring save the sons of the fugitives and perhaps a few Candiots and Cypriots. It is certain that many of the democratic and civic-minded ideas of classic Greek era were also transported, a happy irony in the tragic fall from grace of Byzantium. And in fact, a large literature has developed tracing out these influences, which I do cover in chapter 3. Lastly, there's a very interesting dichotomy or tension between the rise of markets and the rise of what Braudel calls capitalism within a market economy and the friction of social norms. So it is clear that with the rise of the northern Italian trade empires, that a new form of rationality and a new social imaginary, in the language of Castoriadis, was ascendant. Braudel, in fact, speaks of a distinction between market economy and capitalism, and it is in this era that we see the slow and steady rise of this distinction. In part, the capitalist imaginary and the type of rationality associated with it, which has been described by Werner Sombart as economic rationalization, ökonomischer Rationalismus, Karl Marx as commodity fetishism, and others in different terms, arose at this time. We refer to it, or I refer to it rather, as act-based rationality following Robert Aumann. Nevertheless, societies weren't torn asunder, and in fact, the expansion and deepening of markets did not lead to the destruction of the body politic. Later thinkers like Montesquieu and Hume, in fact, spoke of the du commerce, function of markets in this regard, or the softening functioning. In fact, Max Weber, interestingly questions how is it historically possible to explain that in the then center of capitalist development, the Florence of the 14th and 15th centuries, the money and capital markets were considered morally questionable at most tolerable, while the same phenomenon was considered the ideal of a morally praiseworthy, necessary lifestyle in the backwoods of Pennsylvania in the 18th century. It is apparent that despite the growth of act-based rationality, in the language of Allman, in the capitalist bulwarks of the Renaissance, not only was economy embedded in society, as Karl Polanyi has put it, but that the concomitant norm-based rationality, by whatever social or deliberative means, constrained the operation of act-based rationality in these societies. Thus, even the religiously agnostic shared the general ethos of the reigning Christian morality, as Weber comments, as the sources show, when rich people died, very considerable sums flowed as conscience money to church institutes, possibly also back to previous debtors as usura, wrongly taken from them. This ambivalence even carried to the more skeptical and less churchly types who, according to Weber, because was better that way to insure against the uncertainties of the state after death, and because, according to the very widespread, more lax view, the external submission to the church's commandments of salvation was enough to settle with by such a lump sums just in case. As Weber shows, it is examples like this that show a deep and continuing role for norm-based rationality, even within the framework of an ascendant capitalist logic, in the guise of the self-identification of merchant and banking activities as extra-moral or even amoral. Recent research into the founding texts of double-entry bookkeeping appear to confirm this co-determination of both act and norm-based rationalities, which suggests that in fact there was no distinction between ethical and technical aspects of such early merchants' manual guides to accounting practices. So we move on now to the cities and states of the medieval and Renaissance era, looking first at Florence and then moving on to Venice and Switzerland. So the First Republic, although I think it was a bit earlier that there was a commune founded, maybe 1211 or so, 1213. In 1292, there was a birth of the first popular government in Florence. Based on guild membership, again, you see the connection between profession, economy, and politics here. And this government finally enabled the new mercantile elite to remove the factions and lawless remnants of the feudal aristocracy from the Florentine body politic. The next centuries of Florence's history are dominated by the rise of the Popolani. There are also tensions amongst the family and the civitas to be seen, such that Dowland writes, the general interest exemplified in the governmental institutions and procedures stood in opposition to the sectional interest of the major Popolani families. At the same time, those outside the select ruling group, many supporters of the ideals of the earlier Popolo, constantly sought to take a greater share in the workings of the body politic. Thus, we see in Florence during this period a vacillation between what we can describe as popular regimes in which participation in public office reached down into the middle guilds, and governments of a more oligarchic complexion in which the patricians closed ranks. So a very interesting feature of this republican government was the brevia, which was in fact a mixed system of selecting rulers, we would maybe today say mayors or governors, combining lottery and election. So it was as Dowland suggests, a descending principle where those in power chose their successors. The brevia, actually, this was the scrutiny that the system that it replaced, but the brevia was a lottery that followed the ascending principle, meaning the general populace chose candidates according to the guilds, and amongst these was selected by lot the ultimately governing individuals. The shortcomings of the scrutiny, again, this was the prior system, the descending principle, which lay in the difficulty in holding open elections without intimidation or other forms of interference, meant that another form of selection, indirect elections with appointed electors, was then tried. Therefore, by granting everyone in the pool a stake in the selection of electors, the brevia was a reflection of the inclusive ideals of the law-governed political community. It guaranteed the impartiality of the selection procedure itself. Not only was direct interference inhibited, but the process was simple, coherent, and transparent. In fact, Dowland suggests that in all aspects it constitutes a strong application of lot. So I've mentioned in one of the first lectures the blind break, because the irrational qualities of the lottery process are used positively to achieve recognizable ends. The main purpose of sortition was to maintain the authority of the electoral process by protecting it from partisan interference. The process could then be understood as the impartial common property of all citizens. Of course, we can't talk about the Florentine Republic without talking about the end of the Florentine Republic. There are many more details in the dissertation and the cooperative economy. However, I should mention the Medici, who in 1434, Cosimo, of course, Medici, took over de facto governing of the Republic. And this was partly due to a patronage network through his banking income, very generous money that was basically used as bribes all around, and partly was luck. So in 1434, again, Cosimo became the informal ruler of Florence, partly by opportunistic alliances and partly by luck. The brevia drawn in September of that year contained a majority poll Medici faction. His ascent was also facilitated by mistakes in the anti-Medici faction, which left their patronage network largely intact. This means while the Medici, excepting only a few, were barred from communal office, their friends and allies remained eligible. Thus, the resumption of sortition soon proved the fatal flaw to the anti-Medicians. One should mention that the remarkable achievement of the rule of the Medici between 1434 and 94 was that Cosimo, Piero, or Lorenzo never regularly held high office, but used a mixture of patronage and intimidation to manipulate the entire governmental apparatus from the background. Part of their skill lay in their ability to maintain a veneer of public governance that was just substantial enough to hide the true arbitrary nature of their rule. As I just mentioned, in 1494, there was an overthrow of the Medici regime, and one could say an aristocratic republic was declared that lasted not much more than 30 years, in fact. About this, we can say that after the fall of the Medici, the Second Republic was declared, of which Darwin writes that unlike the example of ancient Athens, where we saw lottery employed largely in a preventative capacity, here we see lot in action against well-defined threats to the political community. Thus, there was not a clear democratic prerogative to the new government, and as most ottimati, the aristocrats, welcomed the regime's collapse in 1494, they in fact anticipated the foundation of an aristocratic republic modeled on Venice. However, as historians observed, like Najimi, the Florentine aristocracy was not, in fact, strong enough to create a Venice-like Serenissima. So for the Florentine aristocracy, its choice in the end was between a true popular regime or Medici rule. And the fall of the Second Florentine Republic shows to which of these results the ottimati tended. I should mention one of the most famous citizens of Florence in this area, Niccolo Machiavelli, who is considered to be one of the most misunderstood philosophers, thinkers, and writers of all time, in fact, who was also commissioned to write some histories of Florence and other documents by the Medici, but also led the Republican army against the Medici. He spoke very broadly of the notion of a vera repubblica and the vero principalito, suggesting that these types of mixed regimes that were present in Florence were inherently unstable, and one must decide as a polity, as a society, in which direction one is going. Is one going towards a republic, and then one must embrace the true republic, as he suggested, or if one wants a principality, one must embrace a true principality. and that there's always a tendency to switch between these two if one does not decide. He himself was, of course, a rabid advocate of republicanism, as his discorsi show. Moving on to Venice, it is considered to be a serene republic, La Serenissima, although it's quite questionable as there was never any republican nature to Venice's government. The background, I guess, is one should mention that Venice was a maritime empire that increasingly displaced the dying Byzantine Empire and took over many of its trade routes. And this is how Venice initially came to wealth and influence. In 1292, there was a closing of the Concilio, which prevented any new families and individuals from entering the governing council led by the Doge. So Dowland suggests that Venice, for all its complex electoral systems and despite its reputation as a model of Aristotelian mixed government, was essentially ruled by an aristocratic oligarchy. In terms of the wider picture of the use of sortition, Venice is a major link between the Italian and Northern European republicanism. As republican ideas began to spread to Northern Europe in the 17th century, it was Venice rather than Florence that served as the major example. As I suggested, while the Concilio initially numbered around 1,200 and represented an increase in participation, it very soon created a closed group of citizens, differentiated from the vast majority of the residents of the city by their access to the body politic, and thus, unlike Florence, which had denied political participation to a number of its leading aristocratic families via the Ordinances of Justice of 1292, in Venice, the aristocracy had found a constitutional means of retaining and exercising power. Thus, Dowland concludes in the closing of the Concilio Grande, limited the electorate, and this created much greater predictability and stability than in Florence, where the makeup of the nominating and scrutiny committees was the subject of constant political friction. The Florentine system was, by the same token, more responsive to pressure from the lower guilds and artisan class, and in this respect could be considered as having more democratic potential. Thus, it is quite a misconception to consider Venice an example of either democratic or republican notions, and in fact, it was not always serene. Thus, Van Gelder and De Lavrier suggests that the closed nature of Venice's polity would continue to create frictions and problems between the roughly 80% of the population not actively participating in the political governing, and the rest. While Venice did not experience many successful popular uprisings, it was a place where infra-political criticism and various non-violent as well as some violent forms of resistance occurred. Thus, future scholarship must both reevaluate Venice's status as the most serene and also its relationship to and distinction from the wider tradition of democracy. And lastly, we come to the Eidgenossenschaft to Switzerland. It actually says Athenian democracy. That's actually a mistake. We're talking about Switzerland here. So there's an extensive discussion by Kyriasis and Economou about the relationship between Athenian, in fact, and Swiss democracy. So perhaps it's not so misplaced to feature that here. There were movements in the 13th century away from the Habsburgs, but the official foundation of the Swiss Republic, or what's called the Eidgenossenschaft, or the Cooperative of Oaths. Here, of course, on the right is a coin celebrating 650 years, where you do see a hand making an oath, was 1351. And of course, similar to the Greek situation, there was a use of the phalanx and, in fact, the need to self-defend. Economou and Kyriasis say that the true rebirth of democracy, and indeed in its direct form as in ancient Greece, occurred in a hitherto forgotten region of Europe, mountainous Switzerland, Certainly, as the authors correctly note, there were certain similarities between the two peoples, including dependence on agriculture. Additionally, as they suggest, their military organization resembled the Greek phalanx, in that the Swiss free farmer and hoplites paid for their own weapons, as did their ancient Greeks. Importantly, the authors note that the dense, compact Swiss infantry phalanxes armed with halberds and pikes proved superior to the medieval feudal armies they faced. And within the framework of the phalanx, they were forging values similar to those of the Greeks, which evolved into democratic values. Thinking about the origins of these values, there was also a thesis presented by Econo and Kyriazis that, in fact, much of the council notions of or collective assemblies was, in fact, influenced by the Northern Italian Republican traditions of the popular regimes. Thus, in terms of the origins of the particular democratic institutions that Switzerland developed, the facts are quite obscure, but one theory is that they were imported from the popular republics of northern Italy via Ticino, the last canon to be integrated into the federation up until 1515. As the authors observe, it is believed that the Italian-speaking inhabitants of Ticino were influenced by the participatory councils of northern Italy and actually gradually transferred these organizational values to the rest of the Swiss people. Wherever they originated, a primitive version of proto-assemblies of citizens and at the cantonal level appeared in Uri in 1231, with the formal institution appearing for the first time in Schwyz in 1294. So that's it for now. We will return again with the age of absolutism and moving into modernity before taking a short detour to some non-European sources of democracy in the next